Hello, everyone. Today we're going to discuss a few recent examples of American politicians downplaying the actions of extremists. So let's jump right in. First, I want to alert everyone to a terrific video by Innuendo Studios that covered a similar topic titled The Alt-Right Playbook, The Death of a Euphemism. Please go check out that video, it's linked in the description. Okay, so why are we talking about downplaying extremism today? Let's start with an article from last year, the August 18th, 2024 New Yorker article, Infiltrating the Far Right by David Kirkpatrick. The article begins by discussing Colton Brown, a member of the white nationalist Patriot Front, and his activities recruiting other young men into the group. Kirkpatrick writes, quote, "He led them on nocturnal expeditions around Seattle to plaster public spaces with Patriot Front propaganda. They stole Black Lives Matter and gay pride signs and spray-painted white nationalist slogans and symbols over public art promoting tolerance or racial justice. His crew posed, masked, for photographs while on long hikes together, and they trained for street brawls by sparring with one another in boxing gloves." Close quote. The article goes on to talk about how some leftists integrate with far-right groups to expose them, which is what one recruit, codenamed Vincent Washington, did. Washington and others like him pose as white nationalists to infiltrate meetings and demonstrations, and then turn over the data they've collected to the proper authorities. A bit later on, the article discusses how the FBI and Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, monitor extremist groups. Kirkpatrick says, quote, "Near the end of Trump's term in office, the Department of Homeland Security declared for the first time that domestic violent extremists, rather than foreign terrorists, were the most persistent and lethal threat to the nation, primarily in the form of lone offenders and small groups." Christopher Wray, the FBI's director, clarified to a congressional committee that the threat was largely from adherents to some kind of white supremacist-type ideology, close quote. This makes sense given the data we looked at in a critique of both sidesism. Right-wing political violence is overwhelmingly more prevalent than left-wing political violence. Even still, the FBI avoids using terms like far-right or far-left. To quote Kirkpatrick, quote, "They insisted that we instead talk about a more neutral category, domestic violent extremism, or DVE. Nor does the agency track violence by white nationalists as a category. The FBI favors the broader rubric of racially or ethnically motivated violent extremism, or REMVE, which can include militant chauvinists of any race. For a time during the Trump administration, the Bureau referred to black identity extremists as if such militants were regularly shooting up predominantly white churches and supermarkets. Far-right militias fall under the category of anti-government or anti-authority violent extremism, or AGAAVE, which could also include, for example, leftists protesting Cop City outside Atlanta. The officials acknowledge that their codifications could be confusing, close quote. The FBI officials state that the purpose of this odd taxonomic system is to avoid potential bias. Furthermore, the FBI's primary focus with regard to political extremism is prevention, not infiltration, of extremist groups. A more skeptical observer might speculate that they might also have wanted to avoid antagonizing conservative ideologues circulating in that extremist environment, ones either holding political power already or angling to obtain it. Kirkpatrick writes that the FBI enlists, quote, "local authorities and the public to look out for telltale signs that an individual, on either the left or the right, was moving towards extremist violence. Federal law enforcement agencies distributed 40,000 copies of a previously published booklet enumerating violent extremism mobilization indicators, including disseminating one's own martyrdom or last will video or statement, and conducting a dry run of an attack or assault. But the FBI officials told me that the agency's fundamental approach to the problem didn't change under the Biden administration," close quote. In 2022, the FBI increased its monitoring of a figure who had triggered concerns, the unemployed 23-year-old Xavier Lopez from Richmond, Virginia. Lopez had posted online about killing politicians, which first put him on the radar, and when he was buying assault rifles, he'd been overheard talking excitedly about political violence. He vandalized a car, which landed him in prison for a year, but several months after his release, Lopez joined the Society of St. Pius X, a sect that broke away from the Catholic Church in opposition to Vatican II reforms. Now, the FBI noted in a memo that, quote, the Society of St. Pius X, SSPX, is an international priestly society that promotes the traditional Catholic priesthood and the celebration of the traditional Latin Mass and sacraments. It is named after Pope Pius X, whose anti-modernist stance serves as the organization's inspiration, close quote. Kirkpatrick writes, quote, the FBI placed an informant in the church who reported that Lopez was attempting to enlist congregants in violent schemes. That November, Lopez bought a truck, declared online that he planned to use it in an attack, and posted a photograph of a mass shooter. Only then did agents raid his bedroom. They found firearm components, a stockpile of ammunition, and 8 Molotov cocktails mixed using a form of napalm. A crucifix and a rosary hung over a Nazi flag on his wall. Lopez pleaded guilty to possession of a destructive device and has been sentenced to 18 months in prison, close quote. Then, on January 23, 2023, the FBI circulated an internal memo titled Interest of Racially or Ethnically Motivated Violent Extremists in Radical Traditionalist Catholic Ideology Almost Certainly Presents New Mitigation Opportunities. The executive summary writes, quote, FBI Richmond assesses the increasingly observed interest of racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists, RMVEs, in radical traditionalist Catholic, or RTC, ideology almost certainly presents opportunities for threat mitigation through the exploration of new avenues for tripwire and source development. FBI Richmond makes this assessment with high confidence based on FBI investigations, local law enforcement agency reporting, and liaison reporting with varying degrees of corroboration and access. In making this assessment, FBI Richmond relied on the key assumption that RMVEs will continue to find RTC ideology attractive and will continue to attempt to connect with RTC adherents, both virtually via social media and in person at places of worship. Indicators that would cause FBI Richmond to revise the judgments or confidence levels in its assessment include increases or decreases in RMVE subjects' attendance at RTC or traditionalist Catholic places of worship, increases or decreases in RMVE subjects' activity on social media platforms and forums maintained or frequented by RTCs, or the public distancing of prominent RTC or traditionalist Catholic personalities or institutions from RMVE ideologies. FBI Richmond assesses RMVE interest in RTCs is likely to increase over the next 12 to 24 months in the run-up to the next general election cycle, complicating the overall RMVE threat picture while also creating new opportunities for mitigation efforts. During this same 12 to 24-month period, the overall RTC community is likely to remain relatively stable or show modest growth, providing RMVEs a persistent Catholic-oriented base with which to interact. FBI Richmond did not include an analysis of alternatives in this product due to the quality of the source information and the lack of significant uncertainties. Close quote. The memo goes on to mention the examples of Xavier Lopez, the now deceased Robert Reynolds, who was under investigation by FBI Portland for his involvement in civil disturbances, vandalism, threatening communications, weapons violations, and other acts of violence furthering his white supremacist ideology, and another redacted individual associated with the Society of St. Pius X. The memo goes on, quote, open source reporting and FBI investigations have noted a growing overlap between the far-right white nationalist movement and RTCs. Illustrative of this has been the increasing collaboration of the far-right Catholic media outlet Church Militant and its activist wing, the Resistance Network, with the America First Groyper movement. The ongoing convergence of the far-right white nationalist movement and RTCs was further demonstrated through the increase in hostility towards abortion rights advocates on social media sites in the run-up to and aftermath of the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization decision that overturned Roe v. Wade. Much of the interaction between far-right white nationalists and RTCs takes place online, and adherents of RTCs and other far-right white nationalist groups frequently share language and symbolism, such as Crusader references or anti-Semitic discourses. Close quote. The memo ends by stating that since political violence is likely to increase in the run-up to the general election cycle, it's important to, quote, engage in outreach to the leadership of other SSPX channels in the FBI Richmond area of responsibility to sensitize these congregations to the warning signs of radicalization and enlist their assistance to serve as suspicious activity tripwires, close quote. Now, you might be tempted to think that, given the evidence amassed by the FBI on radicalization in certain Catholic sects and their outreach to those at-risk sects, politicians and the general public worked with the FBI to reflect on causes of radicalization and root out the... No, just kidding. Of course they didn't. House Republicans decried the memo as anti-Catholic. Make of that what you will. And they claim Biden was weaponizing the FBI to infiltrate Catholic churches, which makes total sense given that Biden is a lifelong Catholic. At the time, many conservative politicians not known for strict adherence to sound method weighed in. House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jim Jordan, a Republican from Ohio, and Subcommittee on the Constitution and Limited Government Chairman Mike Johnson, a Republican from Louisiana, sent a letter to FBI Director Christopher Wray demanding to know why the FBI was intruding on the First Amendment. Senator Josh Hawley, a Missouri Republican, accused the Justice Department of, quote, targeting Catholics, targeting people of faith, specifically for their faith views, close quote. And in campaign speeches, then Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump accused the Biden administration of, quote, going violently and viciously after Catholics, close quote, without specifically referring to the memo. That's a very interesting phrase he used to downplay extremism. Remember, the reason the FBI was undergoing this investigation stemmed from actual examples of white nationalists in certain Catholic sects committing violence and vandalism, but those actual examples were dismissed by Jordan and Johnson as violations of the First Amendment. They were dismissed by Hawley as targeting people of faith, and they were dismissed by Trump as the FBI going unprovoked violently and viciously after Catholics. Whether or not they know it, these Trumpista Republican politicians were running defense for white nationalist organizations. Of course, a Justice Department investigation never found evidence of malicious intent on the part of the FBI. FBI Director Christopher Wray and Attorney General Merrick Garland both denounced the memo and had it deleted. They also tightened standards for drafting memos to ensure something like this wouldn't happen again. But personally, I don't see anything wrong with the letter. It merely states examples of terrorist activity and encourages local communities to be aware of such activity. I don't know why that's a bad thing. Regardless, we have here a cut and dried example of politicians downplaying extremism to score political points. That's very dangerous for our democracy. Then, on October 14th, 2025, Politico released the story I Love Hitler Leaked Messages Expose Young Republicans' Racist Chat that describes how members of young Republican groups across the U.S. exchanged racist, misogynist, and anti-Semitic chats. The article writes that these Pillsbury Proud Boys, quote, mused about putting their political opponents in gas chambers. They talked about raping their enemies and driving them to suicide, and lauded Republicans who they believe support slavery, close quote. The article goes on, quote, Bobby Walker, the vice chair of the New York State Young Republicans at the time, referred to rape as epic. Peter Junta, who at the time was chair of the same organization, wrote in a message sent in June that everyone that votes no is going to the gas chamber, close quote. The latter was in reference to an upcoming vote on whether Junta should become chair of the Young Republicans National Federation. Senator Samuel Douglas, a Republican from Vermont, also participated in the chats, and, in fairness, Vermont Governor Phil Scott has called for Douglas's immediate resignation. Of the chat's members, Bobby Walker, the former vice chair of the New York State Young Republicans, wrote, quote, if we ever had a leak of this chat, we would be cooked. For real, close quote. Now again, you might be tempted to think that politicians across the country took this moment to self-reflect and ponder why anti-Semitic tropes are so commonly used as jokes in right-wing spaces, and in fairness, some did. As mentioned, Vermont Governor Phil Scott responded strongly to the chat, calling on Douglas's resignation, and Representative Elise Stefanik, a Republican from New York, called on the young Republicans involved to step down from their political positions. However, the response from other Republicans was, shall we say, less than ideal. Vice President J.D. Vance took the opportunity to condemn Democratic Virginia Attorney General candidate Jay Jones. In 2022, Jones texted a hypothetical scenario where he would shoot Todd Gilbert, then the Republican Speaker of the House, and wished that Gilbert's children would be harmed. Jones took full responsibility and apologized for the text. Vance also said on the Charlie Kirk show that, quote, a person seriously wishing for political violence and political assassination is 1,000 times worse than what a bunch of young people, a bunch of kids, say in a group chat, however offensive it might be, close quote. Okay, a few things. First, remember that the chat logs included comments about raping people and committing political violence, jokingly or not. And second, these weren't kids. The young Republicans members are aged 18 to 40, meaning they're all legal adults. Third, it is more than a little pathetic that Vance is attempting to deflect from dozens of members of his own party currently expressing praise for Hitler with one text exchange from 3 years ago. Timeline of events aside, we should condemn Jones for his text. No one in politics should talk about others that way. And fourth, Vance's own actions in this regard stand in stark contrast to his behavior just a few weeks ago, in which he called for people mocking recently assassinated conservative Charlie Kirk to be outed and fired from their jobs. Free speech for me, but not for thee, it seems. Further, Daily Wire conservative commentator Matt Walsh stated that conservatives need to stick together and not denounce each other. And we may be at a point where the attitude shifts away from downplaying to outright approving of violence. In the wake of Charlie Kirk's assassination, which, in case someone is asking, was a horrific event that should also not be downplayed, Trump was asked on Fox News, how do we fix the country and counter extremism emanating from both the left and right? Well, I might as well show you the clip.
And we're going to look into that.
What do we do about our country with that? Because we have radicals on the right as well. We have radicals on the left. People are watching all of these videos and cheering. Some people are cheering that Charlie was killed. How do we fix this country? How do we come back together?
I'll tell you something that's going to get me in trouble, but I couldn't care less. The radicals on the right oftentimes are radical because they don't want to see crime. They don't want to see crime.
Worried about the border.
They're saying, we don't want these people coming in. We don't want you burning our shopping centers. We don't want you shooting our people in the middle of the street. The radicals on the left are the problem.
You just heard that right. Not only did he say he doesn't care about bringing the country together, he just framed the political violence from specifically one side as acts of vigilantism with noble intentions. He's supposed to be the president of the United States. This comes back to the Innuendo Studio video I mentioned at the beginning, the death of a euphemism. To briefly explain, it's a long-standing tactic of authoritarian movements to preserve or enforce oppressive policies, even they know are widely unpopular or constitutionally untenable, by cloaking their actions under a more palatable euphemism. States' rights is a good example of one that is often used to hide racist motives. It was used to uphold slavery in the southern states, then it was used to deny that the disagreement over slavery was the central reason for the Civil War, and then it was used to oppose the civil rights movement and desegregation. In the world of pseudoscience, intelligent design is a euphemism for creationism. The death of a euphemism happens when bigots no longer feel the need to hide their motives. Here we have seen that religious persecution is used as a euphemism against attempts to counter right-wing extremism. But Trump just went all the way beyond this and all but approved political violence from the right. This does not bode well for where we are going, so be on your guard. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you all next time.